Welcome to the McFeely Mess podcast at Inforum.com. In-depth conversations and opinion covering a variety of topics from the world of news, sports, and more. Here's Mike McFeely.
All right, welcome to another episode of the McFeely Mess podcast at Inforum.com. And our guest today is Ben Portnoy with the Sports Business Journal. And we are going to get into this whole lawsuit, antitrust, House versus NCAA thingamabobber jiggy that Ben will attempt to explain to us at a 101 level, or maybe the Michael Scott level, if you will, right? When Michael Scott asked with an Oscar to explain to him the financial sheets at an 8-year-old level. And then when Michael didn't understand at the 8-year-old level, he asked him to explain it to him at a 5-year-old level. And so it went on from there. So I might be Michael Scott, and I might ask Ben to explain this to me at first an 8-year-old level and then a 5-year-old level. All right. So let's welcome in Ben Portnoy to the pod today. Hello, sir. How are you doing?
What's going on, Mike? Yeah, a lot going on here. Definitely. I'm not gonna lie. The longer I'm in this and trying to figure this out, I think I might have been better served going to law school. But we're doing well so far. Trying to get my hands around it, and definitely a lot going on with college sports right now.
Now I need to get this out of the way. You and I have actually spoken before and done a podcast before, I think, because you used to be at the state newspaper in Columbia, South Carolina, and you covered the South Carolina Gamecocks football program. And you and I were exchanging messages and talking about a mutual, I don't want to call him a friend, acquaintance, a mutual acquaintance, somebody that I covered here in Fargo, you covered in Columbia, an interesting cat by the name of Zeb Noland, because Zeb went from playing at North Dakota State to going to South Carolina to be like a grad assistant coach, I think. And then they were desperate at quarterback at South Carolina. And so they said, well, Zeb, you've been in college for 32 years. You've played with 6 different programs. Why don't you play quarterback for us in the SEC this year? And Zeb being Zeb said, I think that'd be all right. And he went ahead and actually played and didn't do too badly, Ben. Zeb was not bad.
No, it was good. It's funny. That feels like, I swear, like 15 years ago, even though I know it was about, a year and a half, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. It's crazy. But no, it was a crazy story. And honestly, I feel like even being in Columbia in the midst of a crazy season that year, South Carolina started 3 different starting quarterbacks that year, and still won 7 games, really. The context of that, that is still one of the craziest college football stories I've ever been around, of just it's straight up the water boy, but in real life. And, it's pretty wild. And I think probably one of the more underratedly insane college football stories that we've had in the last, decade. And certainly something that a lot of people around Columbia remember and will remember for a long time. That's for sure.
I bought a t-shirt. I bought one of Zeb's t-shirts of the One Last Ride that has him on a horse, and he's a general or whatever, and he's taking one last ride. And so I contributed to his NIL, I guess, at that time, just because me and a buddy back here in North Dakota just kind of found it all just hilarious. And Zeb was a pretty good dude. He got what was going on. He fully understood what was happening and played it to the hilt. And it was absolutely fantastic. And now he's an assistant coach at Murray State. He's the quarterback's coach at Murray State, which is in the Missouri Valley Football Conference now, unfortunately. And that's the same conference as North Dakota State. So we have a Zeb Noland connection, was my point. So we go way back. So let me do the Michael Scott thing to you, Ben. Let's get to the matter at hand. Explain to me at an 8-year-old level, we'll start there. Explain to me at an 8-year-old level what this House versus the NCAA is all about, because it keeps coming up everywhere. And it's been brought up by the athletic director at North Dakota State saying, whoa, don't worry about us going FBS. When this House matter gets settled, then some chips might fall the way we want them to fall. Everything's going to be okay for North Dakota State. Explain to me what the House versus the NCAA is.
Yeah, so there's a lot of layers to it, but the super, super sort of basic level here is that a swimmer from Arizona State, House in this case, right, uh, basically has sued the NCAA saying that, hey, I wasn't allowed to capitalize on my name, image, and likeness in my Grant House, was not able to capitalize on my name, image, and likeness or share in the revenues brought in through TV contracts during my time as a swimmer. That has led others to join the cause in so many words. Basically, this has blown up to say, hey, Grant House isn't the only person who, I guess, lost revenues, quote unquote, or lost wages or lost, opportunities to make money in this way.
So
Dating
let me
back
interrupt
to,
just for 1 second. So
yeah,
these athletes competed before NIL and before this whole new spigot of money was opened up into college athletics. So they're saying basically back pay. Is that the
correct.
gist of what they're saying?
Correct. Yep. We're talking about back pay and then also sort of how this spins forward, and I think is sort of the bigger picture and what this means for college sports, right? Is we're talking about back pay for guys like Grant House and others who have kind of been part of this, that have finished their college careers, can no longer, benefit off their name, image, and likeness in that way. But also, spinning this forward is creating a system in which some of that revenue can be split moving forward. So that's the super basic level. This settlement that's being talked about also includes a couple of other cases, the Hubbard and Carter cases. But for the sake of, I think, brevity and discussing this, I think we can all wrap this all up and say, like, we're talking about the House settlement, which functionally is basically a smorgasbord of 3 different cases.
Okay, so that's the genesis of this. And where we are today, we learned over the weekend. And by the way, we learned also with many athletic directors and administrators at the non-power 4/5 level, because I've talked to a couple of them today and they said, we had no idea this was coming until very recently. But we've reached a point now where they're talking about a settlement, not a decision, not a court decision, but a settlement. So where are we now, and what does this mean that it's going to be settled?
Yeah. So basically, what this means is that everyone's going to agree to terms that include the back pay, what that number is going to be, and then some kind of formula and system on how this money gets paid out moving forward. That's the super basic, like 101 level of what we're looking at. So obviously, there's a couple of different layers to this. It's, how much is going to be back paid, and then what the actual formula is to calculate, X number of dollars go to these schools and these athletes moving forward. So that's kind of where we're at now. There's a deadline basically between, we're talking today, Monday, but by Thursday, there's basically a deadline to resolve this and have a settlement signed and in place. It would then go to the judge and be passed on from there. But that's kind of the timeline we're living in right now, at least.
So a settlement means that it's not going to go all the way through the judicial process. So why is that? Why are the parties settling and not letting the process play out?
Yeah, so the big piece of this, I think, is that the short version is that if this isn't settled, the NCAA and the parties in this case, the parties that are named in this lawsuit, which is the power, we'll call it the Power Five for the sake of this, because the Pac-12 on paper at least is still included in this, would probably be on the hook for damages that could be anywhere from, could be north of $20 billion, basically.
Whoa.
Big number.
Yeah.
We're talking like capital B big, right? Now that said, with the settlement and the way that this would play out basically over the course of trying to say, hey, we're going to figure out this much money for back pay, which would be, I think, about the number that's been reported and been tossed around is basically between $2.5 and $3 billion. And then again, this sort of formula moving forward to rectify some of this other money moving forward over the next 10 years. So that's sort of the basic breakdown of how this would work over the sort of, we're talking about basically back to about 2016 and then moving forward for the next 10 years. So we're kind of talking about a 20-year range, give or take, but that's the sort of general gist of where we're looking at.
Okay, so the back pay that would go to the parties in the lawsuit, House and the other people who have tagged along, for lack of my legal knowledge. The money going forward, then, where would that money go?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think, honestly, that's part of what's being discussed right now of how is this going to be doled out? Because I think that you've got kind of two layers to this. There's basically who's going to get the money and where's it going to come from. I'll start with the where's it going to come from, because I think that probably affects a school like North Dakota State and schools in that sort of realm most. You've seen kind of over the last few days, and today included, there's been some discussion of basically how are you going to split up the pie? If you've got 100% of the pie, how much is the Power Five going to be on the hook for? And how much is basically the NCAA, which functionally means every other conference, going to be on the hook for? Now, the proposed settlement that has kind of circulated and been sort of the leading option, quote unquote, basically boils down to the Power 4, 5. Those 5 leagues would be on the hook for roughly 40% of this total settlement over the next, including back pay and moving forward the next 10 years to sort of figure this out, right? Now, a lot of the conferences, whether that's the Missouri Valley, the Horizon League, the NEC, the Big East, whoever it is, right? Some of these school leagues that are non-FBS Division I leagues have basically said, hey, guys, basically, what the hell? Why are we on the hook for 60% of this when really this is your problem? And we're going to end up being cost all this money for leagues that don't have the budgets and really can't make this work over 10 years. Like, they might be able to take a bath for a year, but to do it over 10 years, like, that's a big, big issue for a lot of these leagues.
Because by the settlement, these smaller conferences, and I'll use the local ones, the Summit League, the Missouri Valley Football Conference, they are being asked to pay the lion's share of the settlement money. While the settlement really involves the Power 5 schools, because they're the ones with all the money and they're the ones that are going to be paying out all this money from the media rights to the athletes.
Correct. And the other part of that too is that you've basically got leagues that are, not turning in major profits, right? Like the big leagues, let's talk about it, like the SEC or the Big 10 or the Big 12, right? Like, those leagues are going to see huge increases in what they get based on the new television deals they've got coming and the college football playoff contract that was just signed within the last month and 2 months. Those are revenues that these other leagues, the Missouri Valley, the Summit League, like, those aren't coming. There isn't some sort of, for lack of a better term, bailout coming that can kind of mitigate some of those damages and some of those costs. And I think that is where a lot of leagues look at this and say, hey, like, why are we on the hook for this? And again, the way that this would be paid out basically would be by the NCAA saying, hey, instead of giving you, let's use a round number, $5 million this year in your payout from us, we're going to give you $3 million. And that's a loss. And that's a loss that is a big, big, big number for a lot of these leagues, in a way that, like, for the SEC, the Big 12, the ACC, Big 10, like, it doesn't matter in the same capacity. And I think that is sort of where this becomes an issue. And that's where the back pay comes from, that it'd be paid out over a certain amount of time. It would be paid out over 10 years, basically. But again, it would come from saying that, we're basically taking some off the top and saying, hey, instead of getting Summit League, instead of getting whatever the number is, magic, let's call it $5 million, you're getting $3 million this year. And that's a big budget line for a lot of these leagues. And I think that's why you see the impact that it might have on some of these smaller leagues in the NCAA.
Well, and the way it was explained to me by somebody connected to the Summit League today was, when you think of money going to these conferences, it's, the NCAA basketball tournament money, for example. But the NCAA in the settlement is also talking about taking money out of other piles, such as grants and some academic awards and things like that. And so it's not just the payouts, it's these other buckets of money, which I didn't even know about before today, but it's, that's college athletics. And the way it was explained to me was, well, these numbers are cooked into our annual budgets. They may not be like a massive, $10 million number, but if it's $200,000 for a Summit League school, and that money is baked into our budget every year because we know it's coming, and also the NCAA takes that away, well, that's a major blow to some of these schools because, again, the North Dakota States, the South Dakotas, the UNDs, the Omahas, they just don't have the money that the University of Minnesota or Alabama or South Carolina has. They just don't have that TV money. and the other, revenue generation that these other schools have. So that I got the sense today that that's really what to is pissing off some of these smaller conferences and schools, is that they're really going to have to take it in the shorts where it's really going to hurt them. Whereas, it's a rounding error. $200,000 for the university or for Ohio State is a rounding error for those guys. And so the smaller conferences are saying, well, what the hell are we paying this money for when it's not our athletes? It's not our problem. And by the way, you guys are making all the damn money, not us. I mean, I think I have some of that mostly right?
Yeah, no, that's pretty much spot on, and I think that's well said. I think that's just kind of that's the reality of this, and I think that why you have a lot of frustration from a lot of the other leagues that are outside the Power Four, where you say, like, basically, like, why are we, and especially I think this is the interesting point, and I think it's especially true for leagues like, I think the Big East is a good example, or let's use the MAAC or something like that, right? Like, those are definitely very different ends of the spectrum, but point being, like, basketball forward leagues are basically being forced to pay for something that has become a problem because football has grown so outsized in these major leagues. And that because of that, again, you've now got these huge numbers that are coming to you, and you're going to be on the hook for these leagues that either don't sponsor football or, don't really care about football, or it's not quite it's not the revenue driver it is at some of these Power Four schools or even G5 schools. And I think that creates a big issue for those leagues. Again, like, you're basically saying, hey, basketball leagues, pay for our football problem. And I think that is somewhere where there's a lot of frustration, and people I've spoken with and others, and I'm sure you've spoken with too, Mike. Like, I think that's the thing that is really, I think, frustrating for a lot of people.
So we talked about the back pay and where this money is supposed to come from because of the settlement. I don't think we've talked yet about the future pay. I guess I'm not clear on where is that money going to former athletes, or is it going to current and future athletes? What's that future money about?
Yeah. So the way this is going to work is, right, the back pay and I think this answers a question you asked a little bit earlier, like, why does a settlement matter? Well, if they don't come to a settlement and say, hey, we'll pay this out over 10 years, I mean, the solution here is that everything's due, like, in a month. And I don't know where anyone's getting $20 billion. Like, that's not shaking the sofa cushions and finding it, right? Like, that's not how this works. Despite college athletics is big spending, right? And I think so that's one part of this, right? So I say that to say the payments moving forward, right? The 10-year structure of this, and that folks are kind of describing and explaining and expecting with this. You're basically saying, okay, over 10 years, you're going to have money that comes out that accounts for the back pay and pays these plaintiffs that are part of this. You're also going to have basically an opt-in provision that says, hey, student athlete X, when you get to campus on your first day of your freshman year, you're going to say, hey, do I want to be a part of this? Basically, do I want to be a part of this settlement? And in so many words, like, you would be opting in to say, hey, yeah, like, I want to be part of this. I want to cut of the pie. Now, the question that's complicating, and I think is the part that makes this increasingly complex and has about 18 different layers to it, and I think is why you hear a lot of this is really convoluted and complicated, is how are schools going to decide who gets what piece of the pie? Because there's a lot of people that would tell you, hey, football team, men's basketball team, you guys make all the money. Cool, you get the $20 million we're going to allocate for this. But that creates Title IX concerns. It creates, budgetary concerns. There's a lot of other pieces to this, like, how do NIL collectives fit into this? Again, like, that's why I think this gets really complicated. And, I had a conversation with someone earlier today that was like, people ask you to explain this at a very elementary level, but the problem is the elementary level is impossible to get to without going about 8 levels deep. And I think that's kind of where we're at. And that's kind of what we're saying, right? Like, for every door that you explain, there's like 6 other doors that become issues. And I think that's why this settlement is really, really complicated. And there's this sort of big overarching thing that is hard for a lot of people to wrap their minds around.
So something we've heard consistently here in Fargo is once this settlement happens, this is going to be the catalyst for the Power 4/5 to break away and there's been talk of a group of five playoff now, that the group of five conferences who have resisted this forever because they didn't want to be seen as second rate or a JV league, now are talking about being kind of their own entity and having their own playoff, which again piques interest in Fargo because NDSU is a member of the FCS, and some people in Fargo, I won't name names, me, have been pushing for the Bison to get to FBS because I think that's a better option for them at this point, to be part of the group of five somehow, some way, than to get left behind in the FCS. So is this going to be that catalyst then? Are the Power Fives, is that going to be basically quasi-professional sports after this? Or am I getting way too far ahead of the cart here?
I don't think you're wrong. I think I mean, here's the thing. I would say that like there's a lot of discussion, right, about is this the precursor to the Power 4.5? Basically, I'll use that use that number, right? The Pac-12, for all intents and purposes, is still involved in the settlement case, but if you're talking about the Pac-4 and saying, or the Power 4, not the Pac-4, Pac-2, Power 4, there we go. Power 4 breaking away, like I think most people will tell you like that's functionally already happened, right? Like the Power 4 is basically its own thing. They are operating in a number and budgets that are just completely different from everyone else. You add that on top of the fact that within the last college football playoff deal, and not to get too in the weeds on this for listeners, because I get it. Like there's a lot of numbers and it makes a lot of people's eyes glaze over, and I get that. But the Power 4, the Big Ten and the SEC are going to get 29% of the revenue coming in from the new deal. That's 58% total. The ACC and the Big 12 are going to get 17 and 14% of that revenue. That's, what am I doing? 31%. So basically you're saying 60% of the revenue is going to go to Power 4 schools. Notre Dame also gets a big chunk of this. And then it's broken down from there. But only 9% of the CFP revenue is going to the group of five out of, obviously a huge deal that's going to be, into the billions of dollars. That being said, basically this divide has already been codified in so many words by looking at how the revenue is distributed, whereas it was a little more equal previously. And I think that to me is sort of, I don't know if I'm actually answering your question, but to me, like that, I think is the point is that this has kind of already happened on some level.
So the big question then for my listeners, or the crux of my listeners, is why the hell are Mike and Ben talking about this, and how does it affect the local school in Fargo? We've already covered some of that because we're talking about that North Dakota State in Fargo, North Dakota, with an overall athletic budget, I think of just shy of $30 million, is going to have to pay in to the settlement to help out Alabama and Ohio State and the NCAA, by the way, so they can all keep their phony baloney jobs in Indianapolis, and their nice cars and everything else, and their vacation homes. North Dakota State is going to have to help pay that. So that's the one obvious way that's affecting NDSU. What else? What's going to be the next step? How else is it going to affect North Dakota State, or is that going to be it?
I think that's the big piece of it. I think it's the leagues and what they're on the hook for and what these schools end up being on the hook for too. Because again, like that changes the calculations, right? If you're saying that, hey, every school, 20% of your media rights revenue, ticket sales, and everything else goes into a bucket for athletes, and you got to pay that out, like that's a big number. And like 20% is 20%, whether you're talking about $4 million or $40 million or $400 million. Like the scale matters, sure, but like North Dakota State having to take 20% of its budget and move it somewhere else, like that's not nothing. And that's a big number. And that's something that people are going to have to grapple with. And the answer is, again, like, where does the money come from? Because I think that's the answer that a lot of people don't have. And that, Power 4 schools, I think, will have donors that can help figure it out a little bit. And I think there are pieces to that will help, and collectives can help out with some of this. And I think you're going to be able my understanding is you're going to be able to contribute up to $2.5 million each in the cost of scholarships. So like if you're saying, hey, our scholarships across the athletic department cost us X number of dollars, $2.5 million, and Alston grants, which is another sort of thing as part of this. If you're saying, hey, we can have up to $5 million count toward this cap that we're going to hit competitively because we have to hit it, That's a big expense, and it depends on what other schools are willing to pay. And I think it creates another sort of market that people are going to have to decide whether they want to play in or not.
So I think it was just today, and I was joking earlier about the non-power fours, the other 27s or whatever you want to call the other conferences. They only found out about this settlement, which was done in behind closed doors, involving the NCAA and the Power Four conferences. The other conferences, the other 27, were completely left in the dark, weren't part of the negotiations for the settlement. And the other 27 just found out about this, I think, over the weekend. I think with some of the reporting and the other stuff that's gone on, which, as I said, has supremely pissed off some of the smaller conferences and the commissioners and the administrators. So today, I believe the other conferences have offered a counter proposal to the proposed settlement. The other commissioners got together and said, whoa, 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 why are we paying 60%? And you guys with a bottomless pit of money are paying 40%. How about if we flip those? How about if we flip those around, just out of a sense of fairness? Now, the NCAA, as it always does, had a way of justifying the 60-40 split because it's, numbers, but they can do whatever they want with numbers and split it up. But the other conferences have pushed back now and said, well, why don't we try this instead? What do you know about that? And does that have any chance, Ben, of becoming part of the settlement?
Yeah, so that's, I think we kind of alluded to it on the front end of this, the 60-40 split or 40-60 split. And that's what's being discussed right now. And I think, as we're discussing this, as we're, talking about it, whatever, that's kind of the thing that's being discussed, right? Like there's committees meeting either this afternoon or right now and into tomorrow and Wednesday that are going to be basically saying, there's basically two layers to this. It's, again, whether they're going to sign on to a settlement. And I think most people will tell you, yeah, they're going to agree to a settlement because there's no other path forward. And then the second part of this is who's paying for what? And that's the part that what you're talking about, the 40-60, the 60-40 split,
yes,
that's being litigated right now, basically. And that's the thing I think that matters the most to probably, listeners in Fargo and elsewhere. Like that's the thing that matters of how much are people going to be on the hook for? What is it going to pay? Who's involved and what does that cost? Again, all of those things. I think that's the big piece here that I think is sort of still being litigated right now and will be litigated probably right up until the 11th hour on Wednesday or Thursday.
Is there a chance that some schools might have to cut sports or staff or budget because of having to pay out some of this money? Because, I'm talking about North Dakota State, which compared to a lot of other mid-major schools is doing okay, right? I mean, North Dakota State raises a lot of money, has great fan support, sells a lot of football tickets, does okay locally with its media rights package. But there's a lot. I've fortunately been around the country a lot covering North Dakota State the last, 25 years. And I try to explain to people all the time that what you see on Saturdays in Fargo is not what it looks like in Macomb, Illinois, or, Muncie, Indiana, or name your small mid-major school. NDSU's pretty fortunate that they're doing okay. Other schools are not. And again, if you're taking hundreds of thousands of dollars maybe out of a budget of a Western Illinois, that's huge to a school like that. So is there the possibility of sports being cut if this goes through at the numbers we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's in the back of everyone's mind. I mean, I've talked to just about everyone I've talked to has basically mentioned that of like, I mean, we're going to have to seriously look at what do we sponsor, whether that's as a league or as a school. And I think that continues to be sort of discussed and tried to figure out. But I think that's the thing. But I think that's the thing is that there's no magic bullet for this, right? Like, let's use a big picture example. Let's say the University of Georgia, right?
Yep.
As a big picture, big school example, right? Like, let's say you go, I'm just making this up completely, but like, let's say you go and cut the men's golf team. Like, you're probably saving yourself, like, call it $1 million. That doesn't include the fact that you've then got to buy out all the contracts for coaches. You've got to, honor those scholarships for X number of years, probably 4 or 5 more years. so like my point is like, yeah, you might cut the sport, but like you're not actually going to see a return on cutting the sport for X number of years. And how much does that matter? And again, like how much are you really saving by cutting
Right.
the men's golf team? And I think like that's the thing of like, that's why I say like there's not really a magic bullet in that. Yeah, schools could say no. And this is the thing that I keep positing to people, and I think I wonder is like, are you going to see a world where the D1 minimum of sports, instead of it being, I think it's 16 now or 14, is the D1 minimum going to go to like 8 sports?
Ooh.
And that's what, is that a world that we could live in? And I don't know the answer to that. I think most people at the NCAA and in college athletics would tell you like, hey, we're about access. We want people to have the ability to compete and sponsor all these things. But like financially, if you can't support that, like there's going to have to be real hard conversations about like what sports do schools sponsor. And I think that like it's the sports of like men's golf, men's tennis, men's track and field. Like for Title IX reasons, like men's Olympic sports are going to be the ones that I think suffer and are cut and have issues staying afloat if that's what it really comes down to, if it comes down to cutting sports moving forward.
Which is interesting, and you sort of alluded to it, but and again, we don't know who's going to do what, but if you cut golf from a school, you're saving whatever it is, 6 scholarships or whatever they have and 2 coaching positions. And, again, a rounding error at Ohio State. While the football program has 43 assistant coaches, they're talking now possibly about these Power 4 schools going to more than 100 scholarships, because the limit at FBS right now is 85, but the coaches are saying, well, but we have 100 some guys on the team. That includes, 25 walk-on positions. So now they're talking about funding all of that. So it's just such a weird, it's just such a weird discussion all the way around. The last 3 years, I don't know where I'm going with this, but the last 3 years have just been just head spinning to those of us who cover and pay attention to college sports. It's just amazing.
It is. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's, a new lawsuit by the day, it seems like, and a lot of financial issues going on. So I think that's why for this, it's, again, it's really dense and it's a lot of jargon and it's a lot of like legalese. And I get that. And again, like it makes a lot of people probably want their, have their eyes glaze over a little bit, but it's really, really important. And I think it matters, from the, SEC to the, the MAAC. Like it's a big, the spectrum is wide, but it's going to affect everyone in a big, big way.
Is there something that I didn't ask you about that I should have, that you want to get into before we wrap this up?
I think we covered the main bases. Again, I think it's a moving target. I think you're going to see a lot of reporting and leaks over the next couple of days, just because that's the reality of this. Like there's going to be pieces moving forward and pawns being played and things like that, just because that's the way that that legal operations tend to work. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting. I think there's a lot of moving pieces here, and I think that this is going to take up until the 11th hour to come to a resolution. But don't be surprised if there's a resolution on some of this stuff by Wednesday night.
So I was going to say you said there's a deadline that when this has to be done.
Mm-hmm. The deadline is it has basically been decided that it's going to be the 23rd, which I guess is Thursday. There's a coming case, another antitrust case, Fontenot v. the NCAA, that's similar but different. And I think the idea is that if the settlement is reached, that that can be sort of folded into this and kind of resolved as part of this as well. So the idea is to get a head start on that and try and get out ahead of it. So that's why there's sort of this pressing need to try and get this done, in the next 2.5 days, basically.
All right. So people, when they read all these stories, when they listen to this podcast, what they have to keep in mind is, number one, the Power 4 is going to always worry about how to get the most money out of something. That's number one. Number two is the NCAA is going to try to save its ass and its jobs no matter what. That's number two. And number three is the rest of the NCAA and the athletes really don't matter in this whole discussion to the first two parties in this discussion. Did I get that about right? I know you're not an opinion guy, but it kind of rolls out that way to me.
That summed it up pretty well. I'll give you that. That summed it up pretty well.
Ben, thank you. I know that you're extremely busy this week because you got so much stuff going on. You do some great reporting for the Sports Business Journal. If people want to find that website or follow you or or reach out to you on social media, how can they do that?
Yeah, I can can check out our work on sportsbusinessjournal.com. We'll have a lot going on the rest of the week, and can follow me on, what are we calling it? Twitter, X,
Sure.
whatever we're calling it,
Whatever.
at B Portnoy 15. So I'm there and easy to find. So yeah, give me a shout, and looking forward to having some more explanations of all of this moving forward through the next couple of days and into next week.
All right. Thank you, sir. Ben Portnoy of the Sports Business Journal. This has been the McFeely Mess Podcast. If your head is not spinning now, I don't know what to do for you, but thanks for listening. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for listening to the McFeely Mess Podcast at Inforum.com. For more podcasts and columns, head to Inforum.com and search Mike McFeely